Well, thanks. This is a real treat to be here today with Doug. Doug and I are old friends. For those of you not familiar with Doug Fluster's work, Doug was formerly the editor of Mother Jones. His work has appeared in places like the New York Times Magazine, The Atlantic, Discovery, Washington Post, the LA Times. And Doug and I are also colleagues at Northwestern's Medill School of Journalism. It's a thrill here to be here to talk about his recent book, After Mandela, which I think is a, first of all, beautifully rendered, beautifully written account of contemporary South Africa, and I think a profoundly important book. And we can talk some about that. I think it's profoundly important not only because does it help us understand what's taken place in South Africa, but I think it also has many lessons for us here in the U.S. As well as elsewhere as countries emerge from years of tyrannical regimes and are trying to sort of find their way to some kind of democratic government, some kind of democratic system. So I thought we'd begin maybe talking a little bit about Mandela. And as many of you know, he's in the hospital now. I think it's fair to say that he's, you know, near death. And I always found it interesting, and I've said this to Doug, that he titled his book After Mandela, not after apartheid. And so one of the questions I have to begin is, a couple of days ago, an activist in South Africa asked the question, would we have been much better off if Mandela had served a second term?
Right, so Mandela Rampela said we would have been better off if he had had a second term because, quote, because he was a committed Democrat, unquote. And I think it raises all kinds of interesting questions about the contingency of history because, of course, Mandela was old by the time he was released from prison. He had been in prison for 27 years. And that kind of delay in a transfer of power to a new government in a liberated, non-racial South Africa meant that he really was in a position where he only wanted to serve for 5 years. I think this question about the Mandela legacy gets raised, and also an assumption that everything since Mandela stepped aside from power in 1999 has been a devolution from Thabo Mbeki to Jacob Zuma. And I think in some ways this book is an answer to that. It says, yes, a lot was lost, both by the fact that there was 27 years in prison, the oppression under apartheid that led to kind of constraints on what the new South Africa could become, but also that it's a more complicated story than that, and that there's a new generation emerging that will shape the country post-apartheid, post-Mandela, post-transition.
So I'm curious, you know, I mean, in reading the book, it's clear that Mbeki and Zuma have had very troubled governments, both their ability to deal with the AIDS epidemic, to the incredible poverty and crime. And I guess one of the things that's interesting to me is sort of the difficulty people often have in sort of at one point being the opposition and then next being in charge. And in fact, we saw that here in this country, post-civil rights movement, where for many, there's a wonderful book, Praying for Sheetrock, I think about often, about a small town in southern Georgia by Melissa Fay Green, about where the civil rights movement came late to that county, and those who sort of really were in opposition to the sheriff there and ultimately took power, how difficulty they had once they had any kind of power. And so I guess I wonder why, what happens?
Yeah, I mean, it's the big question in a place like this. Obviously, people came back from 30 years in exile. In the case of Thabo Mbeki, who is the successor to Nelson Mandela in 1999, mostly living in London, and all of a sudden in charge of running a country that he didn't know, that he had left as a young man of 19, coming back and needing to run a place that was bankrupt. He describes, former President Mbeki describes walking into the office in union buildings after being sworn in and finding nothing. No computers, no pencils, no pens, no paper. in which to manage this developing country. So I think part of it is that that generation came back from exile to run a country they didn't know. And now the presidency is in the hands of somebody whose skills were largely shaped by having been part of the guerrilla army, the formation, the armed wing of the ANC, and being chief of intelligence. So you've got this succession of people from different parts of the liberation movement taking over, who had been out of the country for long periods of time or had been in prison for long periods of time. And to a certain extent, that shapes some of the mistakes that have been made in the last 19 years.
And does Mbeki talk about what surprised him when he came back after all those years in exile?
One of the things you quickly learn if you're interviewing people who are politicians and in political power is nothing ever surprised them. So the main thing that upset Jacob Zuma every time I was interviewing him is I would ask, that's the typical journalist question, right? What surprised you? What was unusual? What jumped out at you? And every time I would say that, he would lean back from the table and look at me. He has a sort of lizard-like look when you know that you've irritated him, and that would come. No, my brother, never surprised. Never admit you were surprised. I think the things that surprised Mbeki, certainly, who was the second president of a liberated South Africa, was the extent to which the divisions between people in rural areas and those people who had migrated and were part of a kind of hybridizing, modernizing urban experience, that divide had, if anything, grown deeper while he had been away for 30 years. The differences between the so-called Amakaba, people from rural areas who have indigenous beliefs, and the Amakoboka, people who were more westernized and Christianized, that kind of dividing line really posed huge challenges to the ANC in coming in and governing a liberated country that had this goal that was announced in 1994 of becoming a non-racial, non-sexist, non-homophobic, and more egalitarian society of the southern tip of Africa. Big dream for a very troubled place.
And so, just to be clear, so why was it that they didn't like the idea that they could have been surprised by what they saw?
Well, because if you come up in Marxist-Leninist thought and you have done the correct kind of study about the objective conditions that are, shaping history, then the last thing that you would ever want to admit is that something caught you by surprise.
You've got this wonderful line early on in the book, and I'm going to just read it, in which you write that you were intrigued by how a society stitches itself together in the wake of horrific traumas. And for me, it's very resonant, because I think a lot about the violence in this country. I think about the west and south sides and how individuals and communities sort of try to wend their way after experience such trauma. And I guess I'd love to hear your thoughts about sort of what that has meant for South Africa, coming out of what was really an incredibly violent period.
Yeah, I came to this story after maybe 25 years of covering stories like it in my native California and in Latin America, particularly in Central America and in Peru, Argentina. Other people, I think, are much better at being war correspondents and being under fire. I tend to be the kind of person who comes in after a story's been forgotten for a while, and the thing that intrigues me is exactly this point. What is it that it takes for people to figure out after horrific trauma, in which unbelievable things have been done, and find the room, the space, the social space, psychological space, economic and social justice space, in order to gain some traction to make something better. And that's what I was interested in looking at here. I think that, I think back to the friends of mine who were correspondents in 1994 in South Africa, who were sent to cover the election, who went fully expecting that they were going to cover a catastrophe. I don't know how many people in the room remember what the kind of run-up to the election was like. There were 12